For centuries, people thought Troy was just a story, a legendary city, a place filled with heroes, war, and myth. Then, people started digging, and underneath the hill in modern-day Turkey, they found something incredible. Not one ancient city, but city after city after city, built on top of each other, destroyed, rebuilt, and buried again. And then came the realization: Troy was real. And that creates a much bigger question. Because if Troy was real, how much of the Odyssey was real too? Now, obviously, some parts are easy. A giant with one eye? Probably not. A woman turning men into pigs? Also probably not. God's personally trying to destroy one man's journey home? We leave that one alone. But underneath all the monsters and magic, there are pieces of a world that really existed. Real cities, real kingdoms, real wars, real ships, and even ancient records that may mention Troy, and the Greeks who fought around it. And that's where this really gets interesting. Let's start with Troy. Today, most historians connect ancient Troy with a place called Hisarlik. It sits in the northwest of modern Turkey, and when archaeologists dug into the site, they realized people had been building cities there for thousands of years. One city would fall, another would rise on top of it, then another, and another. Some of those cities had huge defensive walls, important buildings, and settlements large enough to matter in the ancient world. So Homer didn't simply invent some great city somewhere across the sea. There really was one there. But finding Troy also led to one of the strangest stories in archaeology. In the 1800s, a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann became obsessed with proving Homer was right. He wanted to find Troy badly, and eventually he found treasure: gold, silver, jewelry, weapons. And Schliemann was convinced he had found the treasure of King Priam, the king of Troy in Homer's story. He even called it Priam's treasure. There was only one problem. The treasure was about 1,000 years too old. It came from a much earlier city, and Schliemann was so desperate to find Homer's world that he actually dug through and damaged parts of the site along the way. Basically, he found Troy, and then almost dug straight through the Troy he was looking for. But archaeology isn't even the best part, because another ancient civilization led to something Homer didn't: paperwork. Well, clay tablet paperwork. The Hittites were one of the great powers of the Bronze Age, and they kept records, treaties, letters, political arguments, military problems, and inside those records, they mention a place called Ulusa. Most scholars connect Ulusa with Troy, and that alone is pretty cool. But then, we get a name. The Hittites made an agreement with the king of Ulusa. His name was Alexander. Remember that name, because in Greek legend, Paris, the Trojan prince whose action helped start the Trojan War, had another name: Alexandros. Alexandros? Now, does that mean they found Paris? No, absolutely not. A similar name does not prove that these were the same man. But a real king with a very similar name ruling a place linked with Troy during the Bronze Age? That's a pretty wild detail. And it gets better. The Hittite records also talk about a western power called Ahiyawa. Most scholars connect Ahiyawa with the Mycenaean Greek world. These were powerful Greek kingdoms that existed centuries before classical Athens. They had palaces, warriors, ships, trade networks, and kings. So now, we have something that starts to look familiar. A real city connected with Troy, powerful Greeks across the sea, and records showing political and military problems in the same part of the world. Does that prove Homer's Trojan War actually happened? No. We don't have proof of a 10-year siege, we don't have proof of Achilles, we don't have proof of Helen. And sadly, we do not have a Hittite tablet saying, Day 3000, Greeks still outside, everyone is tired. But there really was conflict in this region. Maybe Homer's war grew from one real conflict, maybe several wars and raids became one giant story, or maybe the connection is much smaller than we think. We simply don't know. And then, there's the man at the center of the Odyssey, Odysseus. Was he real? We have no proof. There is no confirmed Bronze Age record saying Odysseus, king of Ithaca. There's no grave that we can confidently call his, no palace with his name written across the door. Ithaca itself is real. He can visit it. But Odysseus? He could have been based on a real ruler. He could be a mix of several old stories. Or Homer could be telling us about someone who never existed at all. After around 3,000 years, we may never know. But here's where things get weird again. Even if Odysseus himself wasn't real, some details from his world were. And one of them is bizarre. In Homer's stories, Odysseus is linked to a helmet made with boar tusks. Yes, actual tusks from wild pigs. It sounds made up, except those helmets were real. Archaeologists have found evidence of Mycenaean warriors using helmets decorated with rows of boar tusks. And that matters, because Homer's poems reached the form we know centuries after the Mycenaean world had collapsed. So somehow, a very specific piece of old military equipment survived inside the story. How? Probably because these stories were being told long before they were written down. For generations, people performed them out loud. One storyteller learned from another, then another, then another. The stories changed. Details were added. Other details disappeared. But some very old pieces survived. Think of a story being passed from person to person for hundreds of years. Some parts stay surprisingly accurate, others become bigger, heroes become stronger, journeys become longer, enemies become more dangerous, and eventually, you get a giant with one eye. Which brings us to the monsters. Were the Cyclops, Sirens, and sea monsters based on real creatures? We don't have good evidence for that. People had tried to connect them to real places and real natural events for a very long time. Some ideas are interesting, some are a little desperate. But there's another possibility. Maybe the monster didn't need to be real, because the sea already was dangerous. Imagine crossing the Mediterranean thousands of years ago. No engine, no GPS, no modern weather forecast, no radio, no rescue helicopter. If a storm hit, you dealt with it. If your ship broke apart, you dealt with it. If you ran out of water, you had a serious problem. And if you disappeared at sea, your family might never know what happened. Ancient sailors didn't need a real monster to fear the ocean. The monsters may have simply given that fear a face. So, how much of the Odyssey was actually real? The Odysseus himself? We don't know. The Cyclops? Almost certainly myth. The gods? Again, not touching that one. But Troy? Real. Powerful Greek kingdoms across the sea? Real. Conflict around Troy during the Bronze Age? Real. Warriors, kings, ships, palaces, all real. And somehow, through hundreds of years of people telling these stories, pieces of that lost world survived. A city, memories of war, a strange helmet made of boar tusks, maybe even echoes of real people whose name have been forgotten. And that might be the coolest part of the Odyssey, because underneath the gods, the monsters, and all the impossible adventures, there may be something much older. A memory. Not a perfect memory, not necessarily an accurate one, but maybe a memory of a world that really existed and then disappeared.